Margaret Beaufort, the story behind the Tudor dynasty.
Imagine a 12-year-old girl in agony in Pembroke Castle in the winter of 1407. Her screams echo through the cold stone corridors, while midwives with bloody hands desperately try to save both mother and child. This is not your average medieval birth story. This is the story of Margaret Beaufort, a child forced into marriage to a man twice her age, and the founding of the most powerful dynasty in English history. This story is not just a personal tragedy, but also a mirror to the dark side of medieval power and politics. It shows how a child can be turned into a political tool, and how one girl's pain can become the foundation of a glorious dynasty. It is a story that historians have tried to suppress for centuries, but now needs to be told honestly and fully.
The beginning of a destiny.
Margaret Beaufort was born on May 31st, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. From the moment she was born, she was not considered an ordinary child, but a valuable asset. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, was the Duke of Somerset, one of the most powerful men in England at the time. However, within a year of Margaret's birth, an event occurred that would shape the girl's entire destiny. John Beaufort was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Whispers quickly spread through the castle corridors about his death. Suicide, a word that carried a heavy stigma in medieval society. Suicide was not only a religious sin, but also a disgrace that spread throughout the family. Suddenly, little Margaret was not only an orphaned heiress, but also a vulnerable prey. It is worth noting that in medieval society, suicide was seen as an act against God's will, and those who committed suicide were often buried in unblessed places. This not only affected the reputation of the deceased, but also created a lasting stain on the entire family. In Margaret's case, this turned her from a protected heiress into an easy target for powerful predators. By the time Margaret was a toddler, predators had begun to swarm. The 1-year-old had inherited a fortune that would have made grown men crave it. Land titles and wealth all wrapped up in a package that fit snugly in her crib. Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp, had tried to protect her daughter, keeping her close, raising her alongside her own children, in an environment that should have been safe and loving. She even made sure that little Margaret received a special education, teaching her to read French, encouraging her sharp intellect. For a brief moment, it might be tempting to think that this story could have had a different ending. But King Henry VI had other plans. When Margaret was just 3 years old, the king presented her as a prize to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The Duke immediately did what any predator would do. He married the 3-year-old girl to his 7-year-old son John.
First marriage. A 3-year-old child becomes the bride.
The cruelty of a 3-year-old becoming a bride is shocking. Margaret may not have been able to pronounce the words of the wedding ceremony properly, if she could speak at all. The wedding probably took place in January or February 1450, although some records suggest an earlier date. They needed a papal dispensation, because the children were related, which the Pope granted in August 1450. Even the Church was complicit. However, Suffolk's plans failed miserably. By 1453, he had been captured and killed. His political star had fallen, and suddenly, little Margaret was back on the market. It was then that King Henry VI made a decision that would ruin her life. He gave her to the Tudors. Edmund and Jasper Tudor were the king's half-brothers, born of the king's mother's scandalous second marriage to a Welsh servant named Owen Tudor. They were ambitious, ruthless, and had the king's trust. When Edmund Tudor looked at 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, he didn't see a child still playing with dolls. He saw a fortune. He saw a womb. He saw her future. What's important to understand here is that even in medieval England, where child marriage was common, there was an unspoken rule. You don't marry a girl until she's at least 14, preferably older. This wasn't done out of kindness. It was practicality. They knew that pregnancy and childbirth could kill young girls. They'd seen it happen. Even without modern medical knowledge, they knew that a 12-year-old girl's body wasn't ready.
The second marriage. The nightmare begins.
The wedding took place on November 1st, 1455. Margaret was 12. Edmund was 24. Edmund Tudor paid no attention to these conventions. Within days of the wedding, possibly on the wedding night, this 24-year-old man sexually assaulted a 12-year-old child. I don't use that word to shock. I use it because it's the truth. Margaret couldn't legally consent. She couldn't emotionally consent. Her body wasn't physically developed enough for what happened to her. Historian Elizabeth Norton puts it bluntly, that it was perfectly acceptable to marry a child in the 15th century, but you didn't have sex with them while they were still children. But Edmund had his reasons, and they were cold and calculating. Under medieval law, if an heiress died childless, her lands reverted to the family. But if she died after giving birth, her husband kept everything for life. Edmund looked at the 12-year-old and made a cruel calculation. The sooner he got her pregnant, the sooner he could secure his inheritance, even if it killed her. By April 1456, Margaret was pregnant. She was still 12. Imagine being 12 and realizing your body was changing in ways you didn't understand. Imagine the horror of morning sickness when you were barely out of childhood. Imagine trying to understand what was happening as your belly swelled with a child you never asked for, planted by a man who saw you as nothing more than a walking bank account. But Margaret's nightmare was about to get worse. In July 1456, Edmund Tudor was captured by York forces in one of the many minor skirmishes of the Wars of the Roses. They imprisoned him in Carmarthen Castle, and by November, on their first wedding anniversary, he was dead. The official cause was the plague, although some whispered of other possibilities.
Alone in a cruel world.
Margaret was now 7 months pregnant, and completely alone. She could have stayed where she was at Lamphy, but Margaret made a choice that showed the bravery that was beginning to form in her character. Despite being heavily pregnant, despite it being winter, despite the real risk of traveling while England was torn apart by civil war, she made the journey to Pembroke Castle to place herself under the protection of her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor. The journey itself could have killed her riding over rough roads through hostile territory. Her young body strained to the limit. She reached Pembroke Castle, and on January 28, 1457, Margaret Beaufort's true test began. Labor began, and immediately something was wrong. Margaret was very small for her age. Contemporary accounts consistently describe her as small and delicate. Her hips had not yet widened. Her body had not yet grown. The baby was coming, but there was no room for it to pass. Hour after hour, the suffering continued. The midwives exchanged fearful glances. They had delivered hundreds of babies, but this was different. This was not a woman in labor. This was a child whose body was tearing itself apart. The specifics of what happened in that room have been lost to history. But we can piece together the horror from what happened next. Childbirth was so traumatic, so devastating, that Margaret never had another child despite remarrying twice. Think about it. In an age when women routinely had 10, 12 to 15 children, where producing heirs was a wife's primary duty, Margaret Beaufort had only one child. Her body was so damaged by childbirth at the age of 13 that it never recovered.
Survival at a high cost.
The baby survived. They named him Henry, the future Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. But survival came at a price that Margaret would pay for the rest of her life. John Fisher, who became Margaret's confessor and close friend, delivered a sermon after her death in 1509. In it, he revealed how close Margaret had come to death that January day. He called it a miracle that a baby could be born from such a small person. Even 50 years later, in an era that has no qualms about child marriage, Fisher remains shocked that someone so small, so young, survived childbirth. But survival is not the same as being okay. Modern medical knowledge helps us understand what might have happened to Margaret's body. When a girl gives birth before her pelvis is fully developed, the baby can become stuck in the birth canal. The pressure can cause devastating damage, tissue death leakage, permanent scarring. The prolonged labor Margaret endured made things worse. She would have suffered injuries that would be considered catastrophic, even with modern medical care, and psychological trauma. We can only imagine a 13-year-old girl, orphaned by her father's suicide, sexually assaulted by her husband, Ovdua, while pregnant, and then nearly killed while giving birth to his child. Is it any wonder that Margaret's relationship with her son became the defining obsession of her life? Some historians have described Margaret's love for Henry as almost obsessive and suggested that it may have been a traumatizing reaction to nearly losing both of their lives during childbirth. But wait, the story becomes even more revealing because Margaret Beaufort learned from her horror. Decades later, when her granddaughter, another Margaret Tudor, was betrothed to the Scottish king at a young age, Margaret Beaufort fought against it.
Lessons from pain.
She and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, both lobbied Henry VII furiously. Margaret's own son recorded her saying, "The Queen and my mother are very much against this marriage. They fear that the King of Scotland will not wait, but will hurt her and endanger her health." Think about that. 50 years after her own trauma, Margaret was still haunted by what had happened to her. She knew exactly what not waiting meant. She knew what it did to young girls' bodies. She had lived through it. And yet, even knowing this, even having endured it, the political machine continued to grind on. Young Margaret Tudor was sent to Scotland, married at 13, just like her grandmother. The cycle continued. This is what makes Margaret Beaufort's story so much more than a historical tragedy. It is a window into how power operated in medieval England, how women's bodies were commodified, and how even the victims of the system could become complicit in perpetuating it. Margaret went on to become one of the most powerful women in England, the mother of a king, a political strategist who helped orchestrate the Tudors' rise to power. But she never left that room in Pembroke Castle. She never had any more children, and when she tried to protect her niece from the same fate, she failed. Modern historians have tried to soften this story. They speak of a different era and different standards. They point out that Margaret seemed to have retained feelings for Edmund's memory. She asked to be buried next to him. Not her future husband's, but Edmund. But trauma does strange things to people. Stockholm Syndrome wasn't a 15th century term, but the psychology behind it is timeless. When you are 12 years old, and the most powerful people in your world tell you that this is normal, that this is God's will, that this is your duty, what choice do you have but to internalize it? The truth is that even by medieval standards, what happened to Margaret Beaufort was recognized as wrong. The typical age for sodomy was at least 14, often later. Noble families often negotiated special contracts that forbade sodomy until the bride was older.
The truth about a cruel system.
Edmund Tudor's disregard for these conventions, his choice to impregnate a 12-year-old girl for financial gain, was shocking even to his contemporaries. But they let it happen because Margaret was not really a person to them. She was property. Property that could be traded, sold, and used as the owner wished. The king gave you to Edmund. The nobles witnessed the wedding, the priests blessed the union. They all knew what would happen to you, and they did nothing. This is the system that created the Tudor dynasty. This is the misery that brought Henry VII to the throne. every Tudor king who followed Henry VIII with his 6 wives Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. They all traced their lineage back to a 13-year-old girl who almost died in childbirth because a grown man couldn't wait 2 more years to secure his inheritance. Margaret Beaufort survived. She even succeeded in her own way. She founded the colleges of Cambridge Christ College and St. John's College, which still honor her as their founder. She became a patron of education, a political powerhouse, a woman who signed her name Margaret R. as if she were a queen in her own right. But success does not erase the trauma. Achievement does not undo the damage. When she died on June 29, 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday, Margaret Beaufort had outlived 4 husbands, seen her son become king, and her grandson Henry VIII inherit the throne. She had amassed enormous wealth and power. She had shaped the course of English history, but she never had any more children. Her body never recovered from what Edmund Tudor had done to her when she was 12.
Meaning in today's age.
This is the part of the story that gets lost in the glamour of Tudor history. We talk about Henry VIII's wives, about Elizabeth I's golden age, about the Tudor rose and the break with Rome. We don't talk about the child bride whose suffering made it all possible. We don't talk about how the Tudor dynasty was built on the broken body of a 13-year-old girl. But Margaret's story still resonates today. In a world where child marriage still exists, where young girls are still traded as property, where their bodies are still seen as commodities to be exploited, Margaret Beaufort stands as a reminder of what happens when we fail to protect children. She survived. Yes, she even conquered.